Y'all, Chief Blue is obviously a man who needs no introduction to this group. Um, Looking through his biography, the only thing that kind of was new to me is it seems like he spent a little bit too much time at NC State and Raleigh for the good of this group, but I suppose that could be forgiven after decades of service to our community. Um, but it seems to me that it's very appropriate to share with you that in the Rotary spirit, I believe we asked Chief Blue to speak. I think I sent him an email at 1 o'clock, and by the end of business that day, he had just replied with a definitive, absolutely, I'm in, when do you want to do it, kind of thing. So that tells you everything you need to know about Chief Blue, I suppose. And how fitting is it to have him here on September 11th? I still have goosebumps from that talk, Alan. It was just so beautiful. And a reminder that we are always in uncertain times. And it gives me great joy to know that we have not only a qualified leader of our public police department in Chief Blue, but also a good man. So without further ado, please welcome our friend, our fellow Rotarian, Chief Chris Blue.
Thank you. I didn't expect you to read all of those comments verbatim that I sent you, but thank you nonetheless. I'm going to try to share my screen here. Let's see if I can do this successfully. And wait a minute. Is this actually going to work? It looks like it might. How about that? Okay, everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, fantastic. So it's really good to be with you all. I got to just clear up one thing real quick though. I am a Tar Heel through and through. That was the only place I applied as an undergrad. That's what I claim. But I did go to NC State to get my graduate school degree. So I hope you all will forgive me, but my heart is always here in Chapel Hill for sure. It is an honor to be with you all today. I'm going to just click through some slides real quickly, simply to keep me kind of focused, because there are a couple things I just want to share. But then I would welcome just some Q&A. I mean, we're at a time in our country where we need to be talking about how we want to be treated by our police departments and how we want to interact and what we want from them. And I'm really interested in hearing your questions. And I'll be very candid in my responses. But I also think it's important for folks in our community to hear that we know this is an important time. And we know that it's important that our community get reassurance that we recognize many of the inequities that result from policing in the United States and even in our community. So in no way am I going to suggest that we've gotten it all figured out or that the measures I'm going to share with you today have solved our problem, not even close. But I hope they do demonstrate that we're thinking about these issues and we need your help and your feedback and your support. So let me just run through a couple thoughts for you. So issues that we talk about often are focus around bias, and particularly bias in the outcomes of our work. There are a lot of studies out there that suggest there's bias in all of us. And that might be a meeting sometime in the future where we have spent some time as a club talking about it. What we know, I think, clearly that if bias creeps into your work when you're a police officer, the outcomes can be devastating. And so there are a lot of data points out there that might inform your thinking around bias in policing. One area that has gotten a lot of attention is in the area of traffic stops, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes and what we're thinking about traffic stops. When we talk about these issues with our police officers, one thing I want to be sure that I leave you with today is this fact. They care a great deal about these issues. They take their oath of office very, very seriously. And sometimes we do a lot of data analysis, and when we show that data to our officers, oftentimes their jaws just hit the ground because they see these outcomes, and in the aggregate, you could argue that there's some dramatic racial disparities in many enforcement outcomes. But if you ask an individual officer if he or she behaves in a way that contributes to that, of course the answer is going to be no, and they're aghast when they see that data there. And I think increasingly, as we look across all kinds of professions and look at outcomes, organizations everywhere of all types are confronting that harsh reality. The challenge is there's no real, I haven't seen a good blueprint yet in how these to be doing here, which is talking about them and hearing from our community. So let me just jump into, I've got, I don't know, 6 or 8 things that we've done or doing that we think begin to get at a way forward. So first off, identify policies that may result in disproportionate policing and change them. You see there's adverse outcomes for one particular part of your community, address it. I mentioned earlier traffic stops. We also know in low-level misdemeanor kind of enforcement, particularly when it comes to local ordinances in the aggregate, when you see where we're charging people for public urination or for loud noise or loud vehicle, it tends to skew towards communities of color. And I think you have to take a look at those outcomes and decide what you can do from a policy and a law point of view to address and mitigate those outcomes. We do regular updates and reviews of our policies as a matter of routine to look for those areas where there have been disparities. In a couple of years ago, we specifically adopted a policy that prohibits racial profiling, and it calls out that we will do regular, fair, and impartial policing training every year of some kind to keep this conversation in the minds of our employees and at the forefront of our discussions about how we do our business. So I talked a little bit already about traffic enforcement. Let me spend a little bit more time on that because I think it's important. We do a lot of it. Some of you have found that out the hard way. Speeding accounts for 54% of all of our traffic stops, and our community tells us that this is a priority, and it should be. We have people jogging and walking their dogs and pushing their baby strollers and biking all over this community. Yet we have people sometimes zipping by my office on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard at 70 miles an hour out here. No kidding. Sadly, that's not uncommon. Since January of 2014, we've conducted over 30,000 traffic stops in this community. And again, good traffic enforcement keeps your community safe. It slows people down. And when crashes happen at slower speeds, because we know crashes are going to happen, when they happen at slower speeds, people are injured and killed much, much less often. So let's talk a little bit about the bias in traffic enforcement, though. You may not know this, in 1999, North Carolina became one of the first states in the country to require the collection of traffic stop data. Every single traffic stop an officer makes in North Carolina, with a few very small exceptions for very small departments. But if you're serving a community, I think it's population over 10,000, you have to, by law, submit a report of every single traffic stop you do, and it collects all kind of information about the stop, what the officer did, the demographics of the person you stopped, and so on. That was in 1999 that legislation was passed. It went in, the collection of the data started in around 2000. Sadly, and perhaps not surprisingly, nobody ever did anything with that data. It went to the state and maybe sat in boxes somewhere for many, many, many years until maybe 2008, 2009. Actually, a UNC professor, Dr. Frank Baumgartner, here's his book. I'm not a compensated endorser of this book, but I do recommend it. And moreover, I recommend that we have him come to a meeting and talk. He's a brilliant guy. He did some analysis of traffic stop data across our state, all of that, many years of data at that point, I think maybe over 1 million stops statewide. And he came to a conclusion that probably most of us already know, is that an awful lot of traffic enforcement adversely affects communities of color. And the types of traffic enforcement really, really matter. And specifically when it comes to regulatory kinds of traffic stops. So speeding, generally not everybody speeds, let's be honest, okay? That kind of, and everybody makes an occasional unsafe movement, and you don't find any racial disparities there. What we do find is in the aggregate, officers are stopping people people of color for things like regulatory kind of equipment things. The muffler is hanging down a little bit, or believe it or not, and this is a discouraging thing to report, the North Carolina traffic code is about that thick. And there are officers out there who know every single law in there, which means if they follow you long enough, they're going to find some way to stop you because you will have violated something. And what they do once you get stopped, sadly, the data will tell us, depends very much on the color of your skin. So what is important is to think about those specific kinds of traffic stops, where those racial disparities are occurring, and do something about it. Several years ago, we dramatically deprioritized those kinds of low-level, non-safety related traffic stops. And we saw those racial disparities start to come down. They didn't go away, but they came down. I have to applaud our council. Our council this past spring said, you know, we appreciate your progress, but we're going to go one better. We're going to ask you to ban regulatory traffic stops in Chapelville. And effective June 24th, we quit doing them. And so far, I haven't seen chaos take over. The aliens haven't landed. The sky hasn't fallen. And our community remains safe. So I think it's important to acknowledge that there are times that you just need to take a good hard left turn to address a well-documented issue. I'm getting a little long on that one, and probably you all will have some follow-up questions, but I want to hit one more on this slide before I move on. Another area where we had seen dramatic disparities in how these things were done is in the area of written consent, of consent searches. I'm sorry. So we stop you, we say, you know, you were speeding, license and registration, please. And after we come back with your ticket, we say, hey, anything in the car I need to know about? And you'll of course say, what? No, of course not, officer. And oftentimes officers, in fact, we were trained many, many years ago to say, well, do you mind if I check? And sadly, that was regular policing, and in fact, good policing for a long time. That was encouraged. And believe it or not, 1 out of every 1,000 times you do that, you find something good. The other 999 times, you've just inconvenienced, embarrassed, and really alienated the person with whom you were interacting. And the data pretty clearly show us that. A few years ago, we implemented a requirement that our officers, if they want to ask you to search, they have to tell you you have a right to refuse. They have to read your rights to you, and then you have to sign that you were advised of your rights and you either let us search or not. And, you know, perhaps not surprisingly, those searches dropped like a stone for 2 reasons, quite honestly. One, cops hate paperwork, so an extra form to fill out was enough of a deterrent for some of them. And then, and more importantly, informed citizens who now understand they have the right to refuse did so. And again, I haven't seen a dramatic effect on the safety of our community. What I have seen is a clear policy intervention that has, in fact, made a difference. Quickly, I just want to hit on this: dashboard cameras and body cams. There's a lot of talk about body cams the last few years. We've had dashboard cameras on all of our police cars for 25 years or something like that. So that was not new for us. Body cameras, we were early adopters of body cameras. They really are helpful. I don't know how helpful they are for the public because law in North Carolina about how body camera footage can be released is very, very restrictive. It's hard to get that footage out there. And you can argue both sides of whether that's a good or bad law, and people have and will continue to. But the reality of it is it's hard to get that footage out. For me, it's very useful because it allows me to evaluate how we did. And oftentimes we learn a lot from what those cameras show us. Another thing that we've done is designate marijuana as a low-level law enforcement priority. That'll come as a real pleasant surprise for some of you here, but I'll invite you to keep it out of the camera frame while we're talking, if you don't mind. What we know is if you are 20-year, and again, the data tell us this, if you're a 20-year-old sorority girl and we stop you with a joint in your car, you will get a stern talking to and a warning. If you're an 18-year-old African-American male, you'll be pulled out of your car, you'll be asked to sit down on the sidewalk, we will search your car, you will be embarrassed, and we will write you a ticket or arrest you. That's in the aggregate. That's just a harsh reality of policing. It's a fact nationally. And sadly, even here locally, and although marijuana has always been a low-level enforcement priority for us, perhaps policing in a college town will do that to you. A few years ago, I made a very clear policy statement to our employees that we do not care about a joint, and we do not care about a small amount of marijuana. If it's associated with dangerous driving, that's a different question. But if it's simply a simple possession encounter, what we know is we have made choices that skew towards communities of color time and time again, and we need to stop doing that. I am pleased to report when we first started that policy, maybe 7% of our overall charges had to do with marijuana. That number has now come down to 2 or 3%. It varies from quarter to quarter. I'm surprised it's not up a little bit more than that, just because of how many places have legalized marijuana now and how it's crept into North Carolina in different ways as a result. But I am pleased to say that we brought those numbers down pretty dramatically. Sadly, within those numbers where there is some enforcement still happening, you're still seeing racial disparities on who's charged. So we're not there yet, but we're making some progress. I'm rounding the bend here in just a second, and then we'll get to some questions. Something else I think is really important is access to information about what your police department is doing. We publish a quarterly report. It's on our website. It's about 20 pages long. Sadly, it is not fascinating reading, but you will get a lot of information about what we do and decisions we make around enforcement. You'll see a lot of demographic information. I encourage you to give it a look. It's always about 6 months behind, so don't be surprised if if it's not the freshest. We do put a lot of work into trying to get all the data and analysis right, so it takes a little time to do that. We also mandate some kind of racial equity training for all of our officers. It depends on what's available at the time and what our scheduling looks like, but I think always having this conversation means that people are more open to understanding those policy decisions that we talked about before. Finally, public confidence. That's something that is essential in our work if we are to be successful. People have to believe in us when they call 911. They have to believe in us if they witness a crime and they want to report it to us or be a witness. And it is essential that they know when they report things to us about performance problems, or thankfully this doesn't happen very often, where our officers do something wrong. They have to know that we're going to take it seriously and do something about it. It's very hard for us to actually provide that reassurance to people because there are laws out there that pretty significantly restrict what I can say about what I've done with the personnel matter. And that's, of course, to protect employees, and all of us would want that protection. On the other hand, if you make a complaint to the police chief about an officer's conduct, you're wanting to know whether something happened or not. And sadly, there's not much that I can tell you. What I can tell you, though, is that we investigate every single complaint that comes in, even if it comes in on a sticky note stuck on the front door of the police department in the middle of the night. We look at every single one of them. And we talk a little bit about that in that quarterly report. We talk about it as much as we can under the law. We try to demonstrate that where it's appropriate to take a personnel action, we will. And more importantly, if there's things that we've learned from those complaints, trends in training that we need to evaluate, or policy, or perhaps more importantly, organizational culture trends that are developing out of those complaints, our community needs to know we're doing something about it. Finally, increasing civilian community involvement in police decision-making. This is tough too. I mean, our work is mysterious in a lot of ways, but it's really important for our community to know we work for you. What we do and how we do it is informed very much by what you want from us and what you expect from us. And we need to hear from you. And that could be an email to me, that can be coming to our council meetings, that can be coming to one of our community police academy sessions. We try to do 2 of those a year when we're not in the midst of a pandemic. And those are really cool opportunities for community members to come interact with our employees, ask really good detailed questions, get some in-depth explanation and demonstration of things we do, and just get to know us. We also have a standing council appointed advisory committee, the Community Policing Advisory Committee. And they are what their title suggests. They're advisors to me and to our town manager on ways that we can build relationships with our community, communicate better, hear from our community about, again, areas that need attention. So I encourage you, if you're so inclined, I think we actually have a couple openings on that board. Go to our town website, look for boards and commissions, and apply if you're interested. Finally, our council has also just initiated a process to establish a task force to reimagine community safety in Chapel Hill. And that task force, they are accepting applications for that task force. Those applications will close, I think, on the 27th or 28th of this month. You can go to the town website and look for that as well. That's going to be a very focused task force that will spend about 5.5 months, excuse me, taking a good hard look at community safety and maybe alternative approaches to community safety. You know, we hear this discussion about defund the police. This is related to that concept. Are we spending our community resources in the appropriate ways, and are there ways we can look at policing differently? So I hope that if you were so inclined, that you would consider participating or at least applying for that group. It will be a lot of hard work. The good news is they have a sundown March 1st, where they will make recommendations to our council that could inform and be included in our budget discussions in the spring for the following fiscal year. So it'll be a lot of hard work between now and then, but I think it would be, I know it's important, and I think it would be rewarding. So I encourage you to check that out or reach out to me if you want to hear more about it. So I talked a whole lot there. Those are some things I wanted to just get out there for us to knock around. So what questions do you have for me? Love to hear from you.
Chief, thank you so much for that. That's an awesome overview. I know that there are several folks who have questions. I see, we'll open it up to everybody here in just a minute, but some folks have already posed some questions via our chat. And Peggy has a question. Peggy, are you available?
Unmute. Let me video. Sorry. Hi. My question is about the work of the crisis intervention team, you know, especially in light of what happened in Rochester. So how could that situation have been handled by your crisis intervention team? A guy is obviously having a mental crisis. He's lying naked in the middle of the street.
Glad you asked that. Thank you. I was going fast through my comments there and left out one of the things of which we're most proud. So thank you for that prompt. We are fortunate in this community to have a full-time police crisis unit embedded in our daily operations. And that's a group of social workers. When it's fully staffed, we have an opening right now, but when it's fully staffed, those are 5 master's level social work clinicians who go out with us on all kinds of calls and help us respond. I mean, the reality of it is when you call the police, I'm very proud of our people, but really our tools are fairly limited if you think about it. But bringing a social worker with us to a domestic violence scene, to a sexual assault investigation, or to someone who is experiencing a mental health crisis of some kind, it's just an invaluable resource to have. We've had it here for many, many years. Most communities do not have such a thing, so we're fortunate to have that. And what's great about that is, you know, we've seen too many cases over the years, including the one you referenced, where police officer is not the answer to that problem. Now, it's important to dispatch a police officer to make sure a scene is safe in many situations. That's not even required every time either. Our crisis workers do go out on calls without us. But if we're uncertain, it's important to send a police officer along with them, make sure things are okay and safe and stabilized, and then the officer can hand it off to someone who can spend the time, who has the training, and perhaps can make some resource connections that the officer may not be able to do. So I think what's important to note in most every situation, and oftentimes when I see these stories on the news, I'm struck by the idea that you learn this early in policing, but sadly we forget it sometimes. Almost always time is on your side, and rarely do you have to be in a hurry. And so, excuse me, so much of the time, if you slow down, big part of de-escalation is to slow down, to bring the temperature down, to take your time, and then begin establishing some rapport with someone so you can actually do some joint problem solving. I have to say that officers who sadly are thinking about getting to the next call or feeling like they're taking too much time on that call, sometimes make bad decisions. That's all there is to it. Having a resource there where you can hand them off to someone who is quite honestly more skilled in problem solving and crisis management is an invaluable thing to have.
Excellent question. Matt Hatgood has a question. Matt, are you still on the call?
I am still on the call. I may have a bad connection, but thank you for your comments. It's been incredibly heartening to hear Chapel Hill's perspective on policing. And can you talk a little bit about police unions, the good, the bad, the purpose they serve, or are they outdated?
Well, so I don't know as much about them as I would if I was a chief in a union state. Certainly what I know, unions, and I was talking to a school of government instructor yesterday about this very question. I mean, you know, unions are by design intended to help organize and take care of employees. And so police unions do the same thing. However, my observation has been they oftentimes in doing so protect the kind of people who don't need to be in our work, who just don't need to be in our work. And so, you know, risk getting a little political here, and then I'll stop on this subject. I'm not a fan of police unions coming to North Carolina. So that's all I'll say about it. Unless we see, I think the tough thing about police unions is they tend to, intentionally or otherwise, they tend to amplify the worst parts of police culture. And I think it would be a shame for us to do anything that emboldens that.
Thank you.
John Garman has a question. John, are you on the call?
Yes, I am. Hello. Whoops. I think I lost you. Yeah, there you go. My question is, you mentioned that body cam film, it's very difficult to release that in a short period of time. Why is the difficulty? And tell us what are the procedures you have to go through in order to get that stuff released. Because those of us who just see the news and we see a body cam 8 months after the issue, we're just shaking our heads and saying, who's covering up for what?
Yeah, well, sadly, that's what it looks like. And, you know, that was our legislators, when body cameras first were contemplated in our legislature, elected to require court order for body camera footage to be released. Now, I can apply for that court order. A plaintiff against a police department could apply for that court order. It's not impossible, but it does just take some time to get it done. And a judge won't necessarily always approve it, depending on the circumstances of the case and what potentially could, where potentially that case could go. So it's just not, excuse me, it's not something that you could just decide to release. We have an incident today, and I want to have this stuff out on the news tonight. The process is much more onerous than that. And again, that's one that's been hotly debated. And in fact, I won't take a position on this call. I will just say that there are police organizations that want to keep it difficult to put it out. And on the one hand, I understand some of that because oftentimes video without some context doesn't tell a complete story.
Yes.
I certainly understand that.
Yeah.
I also think that one of the strongest parts about having body cameras, period, is this notion of community trust and building community trust. This idea that we don't have anything to hide. And that just kind of making it onerous to release the footage kind of flies in the face of saying we don't have anything to hide.
You better believe it. Yes.
However, again, I acknowledge that there are times that I understand why it's withheld until a more complete analysis can be conducted. It's a tough one. It's one of those things where technology outpaced legislation, and I would argue that's still the case.
How long has that been the case in North Carolina?
3 or 4 years, something like that.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah. You know, body cameras, it's a pretty new thing. Maybe first started hearing about them 5 years ago, something like that. They were first available. There was no legislation on them. Some departments had them, very few actually. There were no rules necessarily about retention beyond those that, you know, your state already has about, you know, public information. But legislatures all across the country struggled to catch up with this technology that very quickly many agencies jumped on.
Awesome. Having lots of folks with good requests for questions. Greg Bradbury's next.
Chris, thank you for an excellent, articulate, and sensitive presentation today. We're lucky to have you as a police chief. I have a question regarding the officers' behavior in just, let's use Minneapolis and the other deal lately, what goes through a well-trained officer who's been on the job for a little while to do these kinds of crazy things, shooting somebody in the back 7 times when there's umpteen alternatives to, shoot in the air, shoot in the foot, don't shoot. How does that kind of stuff happen? Or what kind of, to me, I can't come up with an answer. So maybe you have one. Thank you.
I wish I did. I'd be on the speaking circuit right now for gigs that actually pay. That's really, all kidding aside, you look at the George Floyd murder is the worst thing I've ever seen a police officer do. It just boggles the mind that you can lean on someone's neck until they die. And I can't offer any explanation for that whatsoever. There is no question that there are varying policies around use of force across the country and in fact, even across this state. And so there are certain techniques that we know can be deadly that some agencies use routinely. And that, quite honestly, that's what happened in the George Floyd case. I mean, those kinds of restraints were taught and authorized. Certainly not correctly applied in that case, but nevertheless, tragic, fatal results. I have the same reaction when I see these incidents that you all have. I might have a little more context. I might be able to infer a little bit more, maybe, about how that situation got where it got to. But I have the same reaction you do, horror, and I'm just so disheartened for a lot of reasons. Number one, because I believe in my profession, and our profession is better than that. More importantly, when I know the people I serve see that in Minneapolis or New York or wherever, you can't help but think, oh my God, I hope my officers here in my community don't behave that way. It's a natural thought for you to have. And I know that it makes our job that much more difficult. It's unbelievably disheartening for police officers. I will tell you, folks aren't going into this work anymore. And people are leaving this work quickly. And those few who are lining up, you don't want me to hire. Trust me. We really are reaching a crisis state. And maybe I'll get a chance to say more about that before we wrap up, but I don't use that word lightly. I'm concerned. So I have those same reactions. I think an awful lot of it is a function of poorly trained police officers, poor leadership from their departments, very limited accountability, and a function, and this is the really sad part, of a pretty crummy applicant pool these days.
Excellent. Very good question. Jody Magnus has a question.
Hi. Okay, thank you also for your presentation. And that was a really great segue to my question, which I think it was in today's NNO. I read about the local police department not adopting a ban on the use of the chokehold against, I guess, the wishes of the Chapel Hill City Council. And I wondered if you could say something about that.
Yeah. I think we missed the opportunity to talk about that in a more nuanced way. So let me just say this about that. We don't endorse them in any way at all. Never have. I came to work here 23 years ago. We talked about any strike, glancing blow, anywhere from shoulder up, deadly force. Deadly force. That's always been our practice and our belief. So we don't teach any of that stuff, unlike many of these agencies across the country where you've seen these horrific outcomes. For us, because we never taught it, we didn't have it in our policy manual at all. It wasn't referenced in any way. We have since added into our policy manual that any of those kinds of strike holds are considered deadly force. So what we did not say is they're banned in any other setting, right? So that's where I think our council would like us to clean up our policy language some to make that more clear. What I want to make clear is we don't do them, we've never done them, we don't intend to do them.
Thank you. We're going to run out of time before we get through all the questions, but we got time for a few more. Tom Shea has a question.
Thanks. Thanks, Dan, very much for your presentation. And my question for you is, if I missed it, I'm sorry, but what do you have an approximate percentage of what the minority constituency of the police force in Chapel Hill is, and also how that correlates with the actual minority representation in the community that you serve and are responsible for?
Yeah. So the African American population in Chapel Hill, last census is about 9%, down from I think 21 when I was in school, by the way. Department 6 or 7% right now, not where I'd like it to be, but we're struggling to get applicants of all types. So I hope you all will help us with that. Some of you might be interested in signing up yourselves. And I do think, I mean, this, and not to make light, not to make light of your question at all. There is no question that ours and most a lot like me, and we need to do better. And our communities need to help us with that too, by coming and signing up and referring people to us. I mean, we're working on recruiting and have been for a long time, but we continue to look at all old white guys.
Liz,
I remember Greg Jarvis told me one time that he used to get a fair number of people from the military police force, MPs and folks who had experience down there in Fayetteville in that area, just because they were also used to dealing with the younger population. And I wonder if that continues to be the case, or if that connection is no longer very active.
No, it is. There are an awful lot of people who are coming out of the military who apply for law enforcement because in some ways the structures are familiar. So we still get an awful lot of people with experience. We also incentivize college experience. So that gives us an advantage in recruiting in some ways because we pay you extra if you have a college degree. And I very much believe that having some of your own college experience helps you success in police in a college town. You have an understanding, the place where young people are coming, oftentimes leaving home for the first time. Our job, instead of catching them doing something dumb, I hope, is to create a safe environment where they can do some growing up, survive some of those mistakes, and it helps to hire officers who have had their own college experience and perhaps are a little more open to that philosophy.
Chief, we want to be respectful of your time. You have time for one last question?
Let me get one more, and then I got to go have a boss meeting.
Sounds good. Liz Hinkey had a question. We'll close with that. Liz, are you on the call?
Sorry. Chief Blue, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. Traffic stops can be quite dangerous to our police officers because of the availability of guns in our society. We now have widespread use of traffic cameras. So do we need our officers to be doing most traffic stops, particularly, as you said, there's a racial disparity in the stops that are currently taking place. Hopefully the cameras would not have such disparity.
Yeah, what a good question. I think I can imagine 5, 10, 15 years from now, we will really be having that conversation more. You know, the automated enforcement conversation brings up lots of concerns about civil liberties and privacy and that kind of thing. And you need only look at some of the discussions around red light cameras across the state of North Carolina over the last 10 years to see that. But I do think technology going forward will be increasingly an answer to some of these questions. Also, increasingly a way to make up for some of those declining police officer applicant numbers. I mean, I think technology is going to make a big difference going forward, but there are a lot of privacy issues that folks still wrestle with.
Thank you.
Well, Chief, thank you so much for your time. We're grateful to have you as a Rotarian, East Chapel Hill Rotarian. We're grateful to have you as the leader of our Chapel Hill Police Department, and we're grateful for all that you do in that role and for what the department does. Thank you for your time. Wish everybody a safe weekend, and we'll look forward to tuning in again next week.
Take care.
Bye.
Thank you much.